He built an empire with his bare hands, crushed kingdoms beneath iron boots, made kings kneel and mountains bow. And then, the one woman he never thought to fight for walked out that door without a word, without a scream, without even a goodbye. And that silence? That silence damn near broke him worse than any blade ever could. Stay with me through every scene of this story, because what happens next is going to hit you somewhere deep you didn't know was still open. Drop a like and tell me, what city are you watching from tonight? Let's go. The wind off the Verethi peaks came down hard that morning, the kind that drove ice crystals horizontal and made even the palace sentries pull their cloaks tighter across their chests, leather and chainmail doing nothing real against something that cold and that indifferent. It wasn't weather, it was a verdict. The mountains had been passing judgment on this empire since long before Serath Draxen built the first stone of the outer wall with his own hands, back when he was 22 and still stupid enough to believe that if a man was strong enough, nothing could touch him where it mattered. He had been wrong about that. He just didn't know it yet. Serath stood at the window of his war chamber on the 4th level of the obsidian tower, watching the courtyard below fill with the morning activity of an empire that hadn't yet learned its queen was gone. Grooms moved horses. Stewards carried ledgers. 2 young soldiers sparred near the eastern gate with wooden practice blades, their breath coming in white plumes. None of them knew. None of them felt the hollow thing that had taken up residence in the king's chest sometime between midnight and dawn. Right about the moment he'd walked the length of the corridor to her chambers and found the door unlocked, the fire banked to ash, and the room arranged with the kind of terrible precision that doesn't come from hasty departure, that comes from someone who has been planning, who has been thinking, who decided at some point that he had entirely failed to notice that enough was enough. He'd stood in the doorway for a long time, long enough that the candle he carried burned a full inch down and dripped wax across his knuckles, and he hadn't moved, hadn't spoken. There'd been nothing to say and no one to say it to. Her jewelry still sat on the vanity, every piece. The silver collar he'd given her after Aaron's birth, the amber earrings she'd worn at the winter feast, the gold bracelet stamped with the Draxen seal that every queen of Verith wore as a marker of position and belonging, all of it present, all of it abandoned. She hadn't taken a single stone. A man who deals in power understands what that means. She wasn't declaring poverty, she was declaring independence. General Kavan Orath found him there an hour later, still standing in the corridor just outside the open door, jaw working like he was chewing on something that wouldn't break down. My king. Kavan was a compact, battle-scarred man of 50, with a voice that had been rough since a Norvian axe had kissed his throat at the Battle of Delsward Crossing. He had seen Serath in every kind of extremity, wounded, victorious, furious beyond speech, grief-stripped after losses that would have ended lesser commanders. But he'd never seen this particular stillness before. It worried him in a way that enemy armies rarely managed to. Serath didn't turn around. She took Aaron. Kavan said nothing for a moment. He looked past his king into the empty room, reading the scene the way soldiers read ground before a charge. Yes, he said finally. She did. You knew. No, my king. Not the timing, not the decision. A pause. Her handmaiden came to me at 3rd bell. I rode to you immediately. Now Serath turned, and Kavan had the discipline not to step back, even though something in the king's face made his body want to. The gray eyes were flat in a way that wasn't anger, not exactly, or not only. There were other things layered underneath, things that a man like Kavan recognized from his own interior landscape and never spoke of aloud. And nobody stopped her. She's the queen, my king. She gave no indication of, she is the queen, Serath repeated, quiet and terrible. And she walked out of my palace in the middle of the night with my son, and nobody put a hand on her cart to ask where she was headed. His voice was level, almost conversational, which made it worse. The volume was never where the danger lived with Serath Draxen. The danger lived in the stillness. Find out the direction of travel. Do it quietly. Do not let the court know yet. The council meets at midday. Minister Halcrest will have noticed. Let me handle Halcrest. He moved past Kavan into the corridor, pulling his heavy robe closed across his chest, the iron crown that he sometimes wore in the morning absent from his head today. He looked, in this moment, more like a man than a king. That distinction mattered more than people usually acknowledged. And Kavan, the general paused. My king. Not a word about Aaron, not to anyone. Kavan bowed his head. He understood. A king's heir going missing was not just a domestic matter. It was a political weapon, and there were hands at court currently eager to pick up any weapon available. The trouble with an empire, Serath had learned through the hardest possible curriculum, was that it never stopped moving. It had no mercy for the private griefs of its rulers. It fed on momentum, on the perception of control, and the moment that perception cracked, every ambitious soul within 100 leagues felt it like blood in water and began to move. So he walked the obsidian corridors of his palace that morning with precisely the same bearing he had carried for 18 years of kingship. The wide shoulders set back, the stride unhurried, the face presenting that particular blankness that powerful men cultivate like armor. He nodded to stewards. He received the morning dispatches from the border stations without visible reaction. He sat at the head of the long table in the war chamber and listened to Captain Aaron Dove read a report about grain shortages in the Sundreep province. Inside, something was burning. Not fire exactly, something colder. Something that had been building for longer than he'd admitted to himself, assembling quietly in the basement of his chest where he'd refused to look. He thought about the last real conversation he'd had with Neris. Not an exchange, not the careful diplomatic interaction of two people sharing a palace and a son and an arrangement. A real conversation, the kind where something living passed between two people. He had to go back 3 months to find it. 3 months. She'd been reading in the garden room off the east wing, that small warm space she'd made her own with plants from the coastal provinces and a low fire and books he'd never seen her without. He'd come to tell her something about Aaron's tutor schedule. Nothing significant, and she'd looked up from her pages with those clear dark eyes, and there had been a moment, 2 heartbeats long, maybe 3, where something honest had almost happened between them, where he'd been on the edge of sitting down across from her and saying something real. And then an aide had appeared at the door with a dispatch from the eastern frontier, and he'd taken the dispatch and walked away, and she had gone back to her book. He hadn't thought about that moment again until right now. He wondered if she had. The council meeting at midday was a performance, and Serath had been performing since before half the men in that room had grown their first beard. Minister Halcrest, a thin-necked man with the restless eyes of someone who had survived 4 changes of power through a superior talent for reading the direction of wind, watched him from across the long table with an attention that was almost flattering in its intensity. Lord Commander Vane reported on the eastern frontier tensions, the 2 sentences that mattered buried in 6 paragraphs of tactical language. Treasurer Idris brought numbers that told a story of an empire that was prosperous enough to weather unrest, but not rich enough to ignore it. Standard, manageable. The business of keeping a large and complicated machine functioning. Then Halcrest said it, smooth as oil on stone, almost casual, almost kind. The Queen was not at breakfast, my king. I hope she is not unwell. The room paused, just slightly, the way a room does when everyone in it already knows something and is waiting to discover who else knows it. Serath looked at Halcrest with the full weight of the gray eyes that had made battle-hardened men look elsewhere. The Queen is resting. She'll be at the evening meal. He let a single beat pass. Is there something in your portfolio that requires her presence, Minister? Because if not, her health is not a matter for this council. Halcrest withdrew. Smoothly. Without shame, because men like Halcrest didn't experience shame as others did. They experienced miscalculation, and they adjusted. Of course, my king. My concern is only for her well-being. Noted, Serath said, and moved on. He was 3 hours past midday when Lady Celine Morvain found him in the upper corridor, the one that ran along the inner wall with windows looking down into the training yard. She had, he noticed, with the part of his mind that catalogued everything whether he wanted it to or not, an instinct for finding him in unguarded moments. She had always had that. It had once been something he associated with intimacy. He was beginning to reconsider the taxonomy. She was wearing gray silk, and her dark hair was wound up in the northern style, and she walked toward him with the particular confidence of someone who had assessed the situation and found it favorable. "You look like you haven't slept," she said. "I haven't." She came to stand beside him at the window, looking down at the training yard. Below, the 2 young soldiers from that morning were still at it, bruised and determined. She's gone then. Not a question. She said it simply, almost gently, the way you acknowledge weather. He kept his eyes on the yard. Careful. I'm being careful. I'm speaking to you privately, not to a court. She paused. I heard it from her handmaiden's cousin. You know how these palaces work. I do. Serath. She turned toward him. There was something in her face that had been there since she returned. A certainty that he'd thought, on better days, was confidence, and on worse ones, read differently. This doesn't have to be a disaster. It can be a beginning. He was quiet for a long moment. Below, one of the soldiers landed a clean blow to the other's shoulder, and the struck man stumbled, then reset his feet and came back. That was the thing about training under a real system. You learned to come back from the blow. You learned that the blow was not the end. Go to your chambers, Celine, he said. His voice was without heat. That was deliberate. She tilted her head. Are you angry with me? I'm not anything with you right now. He looked at her then, directly, and something in the look made her go still. I need to think. And you being present is not helping me think. She studied him for a moment. Then, with the grace that was both genuine and cultivated, he had never been entirely sure which was which in her. She withdrew. Her footsteps were silent on the stone. He watched her go and felt nothing clean. That was the honest truth that he turned over for the rest of that afternoon. He had convinced himself in the weeks since Celine's return that what he was feeling was something like recovered clarity, that the history between them was wisdom returning, that the pull toward her was not weakness but the correction of an old injustice, a reclamation of something that politics had wrongly taken. He had told himself of this with the full conviction of a man who had spent decades convincing councils and kings of things, and had gotten very good at deploying the same machinery on himself. But there is a particular kind of reckoning that arrives only in the aftermath, when the noise falls away and what you actually did sits in front of you without decoration. And the noise had fallen away. And what sat in front of him now was this: a woman who had shared his palace for 8 years, who had raised his son with a steadiness that the boy's own father hadn't matched, who had endured an arrangement that asked everything of her and offered very little in return. That woman had reached the end of what she could carry, and she had done it quietly, without accusation, without performance. And he had been so focused on what he thought he was reclaiming that he had not once considered what he was discarding. The Empire had a philosophy about this. Serath had enforced it 100 times. Sentiment is a luxury. Decisions of state cannot be held hostage to personal feeling. The needs of the realm outweigh the needs of any individual, including the individuals who wear the crown. He had said these words to young commanders, to grieving widows of fallen nobles, to his own reflection on mornings when he doubted. He had believed them. He still believed them, in the abstract. But there are beliefs that function as architecture, holding everything up, and then there are the moments when the architecture shows you its cracks. And the crack here was simple and devastating. He had used the philosophy of hard necessity to avoid examining whether what he was doing was necessary at all, or whether it was just what he wanted, dressed in the vocabulary of duty. He ate alone that evening. His steward asked, with the practiced neutrality of a man who survived by reading the room, whether the queen would be joining him. Serath said no. The steward did not ask again. It was after the dinner hour, in the hour when the palace settled into its nighttime rhythms, that Cavan returned. He came to the war chamber alone, closed the door, and stood before his king with the manner of a soldier delivering a report he would rather not give. Northeast Road, Cavan said. She took one of the secondary carriages, 2 of her own staff. Aaron was wrapped in that green cloak he likes, the wool one. The gate guard said he was asleep. He paused. She gave the gate guard a sealed letter for you. He held it, thinking there would be a direct instruction to bring it to you. When there wasn't, he wasn't sure of the protocol. Serath extended his hand. The letter was single-paged, the writing in Neris's hand, precise, unhurried. The letters formed with the same economy she brought to everything. There were only 3 paragraphs. He read them twice. He did not read them aloud, and he would not, then or later, share their full content with anyone. But the last line stayed behind his sternum like something lodged there. It read, I have learned your language, Serath. I have lived inside it for 8 years. The word that your language has no translation for is enough. I have finally learned mine. He set the letter on the table. He looked at the fire in the iron grate across the room. He breathed in, then out, slowly, the way he'd learned to breathe in the middle of battles when everything around him was screaming and he needed to be the one thing that was not. "Pull the border deployment reports," he said finally. "Eastern frontier. I want to see what Orvain's clan has actually moved in the last 30 days, not what they've reported. And bring me Captain Rael Sorin. I want to speak with him before first bell." Kavan's expression did not change, but something in his posture relaxed fractionally. His king was moving. A king who was moving was a king who was functioning, and a king who was functioning kept the people around him alive. "Yes, my king." "And Kavan?" Serath looked up from the fire. "Send a quiet rider northeast. Not soldiers, just a rider. I want to know she arrived somewhere safe." A pause that cost him something to control. That they both did. He did not say what happened after that, did not say what came next, because what came next was not yet clear, even to him. Kavan left. The fire settled. The Empire slept. And in the darkness of the war chamber, the King of Vareth sat alone with the understanding that the most significant defeat of his life had come not on any battlefield, but in a corridor lined with his own banners, while he stood looking at a room arranged for departure. Whoa. The morning that followed arrived gray and unwilling. Serath was already in the lower training yard at the hour before dawn, working forms with a longsword against a wooden post, which was the thing he had done since boyhood, when his mind refused to quiet. The practice blades from the afternoon before lay stacked nearby. His breath came hard and visible in the cold air. He was still wearing the plain undershirt from his chambers, no armor, and the temperature was deep enough that lesser men would have been shaking. He was not shaking. He was working through the third progression of the Varethi cutting forms, the sequence that prioritized control over power, that required the wrist to settle at the bottom of each motion rather than driving through, and he made himself perform each motion correctly before moving to the next one. Incorrectly performed motion in training becomes incorrectly performed motion in the field, and in the field it gets you dead. His trainers had ground that into him at age 12, and it had never left. Captain Rael Sorin arrived as the sky began lightening in the east. He was a lean man, 37, one of the intelligence officers Serath trusted more than most, because Sorin had a rare and valuable incapacity for flattery. He told you what was true. He did not tell you what he thought you wanted to hear, because he had apparently never bothered to identify what that was. Some men in the palace found him abrasive. Serath found him invaluable. "My king." Sorin stood at the edge of the yard, watching the sword work without expression. He had a leather folio under one arm. Serath planted the sword point down in the dirt and looked at him. "The Orvain clan, tell me what you know that isn't in the reports." Sorin opened the folio. He didn't look at it much. He'd clearly already lived with the contents long enough to carry them in his head. 3 months ago, Clan Chief Orvain took a meeting with Lord Fentress of the Fourth House. Fentress has been positioning himself behind... He stopped. Recalibrated. Fentress has been aligning with certain interests at court that are newer to the palace than some others. Say it plainly. He's been meeting with Lady Celine's household staff regularly. What's discussed I don't have in full, but the pattern is clear enough. Sorin looked up from the folio. The Orvain clan's movement toward the eastern passes is not independent. Someone is encouraging them to create pressure at the border. Enough unrest to justify martial attention in that direction. Serath was still. While the court is distracted. That would be the strategic logic, yes. Sorin closed the folio. The Queen's departure will reach the noble houses within 2 days. I'm estimating less. When it does, there will be parties who interpret it as opportunity. Because a king managing a domestic crisis is a king not managing his flank. Yes. Serath pulled the sword from the ground and handed it to the rack boy who materialized from the shadows the way palace staff always did. He turned toward the far wall of the yard, his back to Sorin for a moment. His hands rested at his sides, not fisted. He'd broken himself of that tell years ago, but Sorin would have been watching for other tells. Who in the court is genuine? If I needed to convene an inner circle tomorrow, people who are loyal to the crown, not to the current political weather. Sorin considered this with the seriousness it deserved. Kavan, Without question, Lord Idris on the treasury side. He's loyal because his loyalty is mathematical. He understands which side of this arrangement keeps the economy stable. Captain Dove. She follows the chain of command to its source and no further. A pause. There are others. Fewer than you'd hope. There always are. Serath turned back. Go through Halcrest's correspondence for the last 90 days, quietly. I want to know who he's been talking to. That's a significant escalation of, I know what it is. Serath met Soren's eyes. I'm not asking you to move against him yet. I'm asking you to tell me whether I need to. Soren gave a single nod. He would handle it the way he handled everything, efficiently, invisibly, and without dramatic commentary. He withdrew, and Serath stood alone in the empty training yard while the sky finished deciding whether it was going to rain or simply threaten. He thought about Aaron. This was the thing that sat beneath everything else, heavier than the political threat, heavier than Celine's ambitions or Halcrest's positioning or the Orvain clan's convenient restlessness. His son, 7 years old, quiet and watchful in the way that children are quiet and watchful when they have grown up listening to spaces between words, reading the rooms their parents fill. Aaron had Neris's eyes and Serath's jaw and a temperament that was somehow entirely his own. Curious without being reckless, careful without being timid. He'd come to Serath's war chamber 3 weeks ago and stood at the edge of the room looking at the campaign maps on the table, and Serath had watched him trace the river routes with one small finger without touching the surface, as if he understood already that some things you looked at but didn't disturb. He had not thought to call the boy over, had not thought to explain the maps or ask what questions lived behind that careful gaze. He'd had a dispatch to finish. The dispatch was gone now. Finished and sent and forgotten. Aaron was on a road somewhere northeast, wrapped in a green cloak. The rain came. Serath stood in it for a long moment without moving, which was something he would not have permitted himself in sight of anyone who could report it, which was why he'd risen before the yard filled. Then he turned and walked inside, water darkening the plain shirt across his shoulders, and the Empire caught his footsteps and resumed around him. 3 days passed. On the first day, Halcrest engineered a council discussion about succession procedure that was technically routine and actually a message. Serath let it proceed and watched every face in the room with the peripheral vision of a man trained to assess threats while looking elsewhere. On the second day, Lord Fentress requested a private audience and was told the king was occupied. He requested again in the afternoon. He was told the same. Serath tracked the displeasure that created the way you tracked weather patterns. On the third day, Celine came to him in the map room with a proposal. She was direct. He had always respected that about her, even now, when the directness carried a different edge. She stood across the large table from him, the maps of the Empire between them, and she said it without ornamentation. The court is fracturing. You know it. I know it. The Queen's absence is the crack, and there are people in this palace who will drive a wedge into that crack every hour that it remains open. She laid her hands flat on the table, leaning forward slightly. You need to present a stable front. I can give you that. You want to be queen, Serath said. No judgment in the delivery, just identification. I want Vareth to remain functional. You want the same thing. The geometry of our interests has always been compatible. He looked at her over the maps. The gray daylight through the high windows fell across her face without sentimentality, and he saw her clearly in it, genuinely formidable, genuinely strategic, genuinely capable of performing the function she was describing. And he also saw what Soren's report had told him, visible now in the too precise reasoning, the too perfect framing of her appeal as civic duty rather than personal ambition. The geometry of interests, he repeated. Yes, that's a calculation, Celine. She met his gaze without flinching. Everything in this room is a calculation. I'm not insulting you by being honest about it. No, he said, and the word was quiet. But you might be misjudging what I'm calculating. She didn't withdraw from it. That was its own kind of answer about who she was. What are you calculating? She asked. He looked down at the map. The rivers, the mountain ranges, the eastern frontier marked in red thread. The coastal territories where the trade winds came off the water, all of it assembled into the shape of something he'd spent his entire adult life maintaining, and for the first time in that adult life, he found himself measuring it against a different scale, measuring what it had cost to build, what it had consumed, who it had ground down in the machinery of its necessity. He thought of a woman reading in a garden room, of a small boy tracing rivers on a map without touching the surface, of a note with 3 paragraphs and a last line that had not left him. "Come back to me tonight," he said. "I'll give you my answer tonight." Celine looked at him for one long, assessing moment. Then she straightened and left the room. Serath looked at the map. The eastern frontier, marked in red. The red was spreading. He was still looking at it when Kayvon appeared at the door with the expression of a man carrying weight. "Rider from the Northeast Pass, my king." Serath lifted his head. "There's been a report." Kayvon's voice was careful. A carriage matching the description of the Queen's was stopped at the crossroads of the Halveth Road by armed men. He paused. "She's not hurt. Aaron is not hurt. But they were held for 2 hours before a regional garrison intervened." The room was very quiet. "Held," Serath said. "Yes, my king." "By whose men?" Kayvon's jaw worked for a moment. The answer was in his face before his voice confirmed it. "The crest on their horses. Third House colors. Lord Fentress's colors." The cold thing in Serath's chest shifted. It had been grief and recognition and self-reckoning for 3 days. It had been the complicated interior weather of a man confronting his own failures. But now it changed into something much older and much simpler, something that had been there since long before he was a king, something honed and unambiguous. He stood. He was very still for a moment. Then, "Get me my armor." Kayvon was already moving. "And Kayvon," the voice was flat now, stripped. "Send for Soren and pull Fentress's household riders. Every one of them. I want them detained within the hour." "My king," Kayvon was almost at the door. "And the Queen's position. I want a full military escort on that road within 2 hours. Not border soldiers. Palace guard. My personal guard." "Understood." The door closed. Serath stood alone in the map room with the red-threaded frontier and the silence of a man who has just moved from reckoning into action. The transition was not relief, but it was clarity. And sometimes clarity, even when it arrives at the worst possible cost, is the thing you needed most to see by. He picked up the red thread from the map table, held it in his fist for a moment, set it back down. Someone had reached for his son. Someone in this palace. Someone sitting at his council table, eating his food, spending his treasury's coin, had sent armed men after a woman and a 7-year-old boy on a northeast road. He understood now that the last 3 days of interior reckoning had been necessary. He didn't regret them. A man who could not examine himself was a man operating blind, and blind men don't survive long in rooms full of people who are watching. But the examination was over. There were things broken that he had broken. He would have to sit with that truth for the rest of his life, and he would, because he was, beneath everything, a man who did not run from what he'd done. But there were other things broken in this palace that were not his breaking, and those things he had a very particular capability for addressing. He walked to the armor stand where his war pieces waited. Outside, the first shouts of preparation were already cutting through the palace corridors. The organized, purposeful noise of a machine being activated by a king who has made a decision. And in a room 2 floors below, Lord Fentress received a knock at his door that he had not been expecting, and opened it to find 4 palace guards standing in his corridor with expressions that told him, before a single word was spoken, that the calculation he had made about Serath Draxen's distraction had contained one catastrophic error. He had mistaken grief for vulnerability. He had not understood that in certain men those two things are not the same. Not the same at all. Serath's left greaves snapped into place, then the right. The armor-bearer's hands moved fast and certain across the buckles, and the King of Verith looked straight ahead at the wall while his mind moved through the next 6 hours with the focused, merciless attention that had built this empire from nothing. There was one question he had not yet answered, one conversation still outstanding, promised for tonight. Celine was waiting in her chambers for a verdict. What she did not know, what no one in this palace yet knew, was that the rider from the northeast had brought a second piece of information. Smaller. Buried in the debrief from the garrison captain who had intervened at the Halveth crossroads. The garrison captain reported that when his men arrived, Queen Neris had already barricaded the carriage door and was in negotiation with the armed men through the window. Not screaming, not begging. Negotiating in a voice the captain described as steady and unhurried, as if she were discussing grain prices at a market stall rather than the safety of herself and her child. When the garrison arrived and the armed men fell back, the captain had approached the carriage to confirm her safety. He had asked if she required medical attention. She had said no. He had asked if she required an escort to continue northeast. She had said yes. And then she had said one more thing, which the captain had dutifully included in his report because he was a thorough man, though he confessed he wasn't entirely sure of its significance. She'd said, "Tell whoever receives this report that we are well, and tell them that what happened here today is information the king will want to have. He will know what to do with it." Serath read that line again, in his mind, read it one more time. She had known the report would reach him. She had known, even on a northeast road with armed men at her window, that the information chain of the empire she had lived inside for 8 years would carry the news back to him. She had not sent a personal message. She had understood, with a clarity that put his own intelligence operation to shame, that the official report was the message. She was telling him something. He was still working out what. The last buckle caught. The armor-bearer stepped back. Serath turned from the wall, fully armed now, and walked toward the door of the chamber. And a king who had spent 3 days learning the weight of what he had lost was about to walk into a palace where the ground had shifted beneath everyone's feet. He pulled open the door. In the antechamber, Soren was waiting with a face like winter ice and a leather folio already open. "Halcrest," Soren said before Serath could speak. Serath stopped. "The correspondence I pulled." Soren's voice was quiet and completely controlled. "Halcrest has been writing to a party outside the Empire, monthly, for the last year. The letters go through a merchant proxy in Sundreep." He looked up from the folio. "My king, the external party is not a trade partner." The corridor was empty except for the two of them. "Then what is it?" Serath said. Soren met his eyes, and something in the intelligence captain's composure shifted, just fractionally, the way a very steady man shifts when he is delivering information that changes the shape of the room. "It is a succession broker," Soren said, "working on behalf of a coalition of Eastern bloodlines who have been building a case for regime transition for the last 18 months. Serath was still. "There are names in the correspondence," Soren continued. "Not all of them, but enough." He paused. "My king, one of the names is someone who is currently in this palace." The silence that followed had a particular texture. "Show me," Serath said. Soren turned the page of the folio. Serath looked at the name written there in Halcrest's careful hand, the name of the person who had been planning with outside parties for a year and a half, the person who had returned to this palace not as memory reborn, but as an agent of a design that had been in motion long before her carriage came through the palace gates. He looked at it for a long time. Outside the window, the first riders were already moving through the courtyard, armor catching the gray morning light, heading northeast on a road toward a woman who had known, even in her leaving, that the information would find its way back. The name on the page was Celine Morvain, and tonight he had promised her an answer. The name sat there in Halcrest's careful script and did not move, because names on pages don't move. They just wait for the person reading them to absorb the full weight of what they mean. Serath read it twice, which was once more than he needed. The second reading was not for comprehension. It was for the particular discipline of making himself remain still, while his interior architecture rearranged itself around a new and structural fact. Celine Morvain, not Halcrest, not Fimas, not Fentress, not some Eastern bloodline broker operating through Sundreep merchant proxies. Those men were instruments. This was the hand that had been directing the instrument. He closed the folio, handed it back to Soren with a steadiness that came not from the absence of feeling, but from 18 years of practice at containing it. "How much of this does she know that I know?" Soren took the folio without looking away from his king's face. He was reading him the way good intelligence officers read everything, for what wasn't said, for the gaps, for the tells that reveal the true shape of a situation. "None of it," he said. "The correspondence pull was done without palace communication. She has no reason to suspect the garrison report reached you so quickly, and she's expecting you in her chambers tonight for an answer." "She is," Serath agreed. "My king." Soren's voice was careful now, the way a man's voice gets careful when he is about to say something that carries more than information. What she was offering you this afternoon, the stable front, the political geometry, that proposal was not incidental. That was the endgame of 18 months of positioning. If you had said yes this evening, you would have handed her exactly the proximity she needed to complete what the correspondence describes. I know what I would have handed her. Then you also know that her interest was never in you. The corridor was still empty. Outside, he could hear the preparation noise of the palace yard, horses and armor, and the low, urgent instructions of men mobilizing. I know, Serath said, and the two words were quiet in a way that Soren recognized as finality rather than grief. The king was past the personal accounting of this particular discovery. He had done that work in the 3 days since Neris left, sitting in the war chamber with a letter and a fire, dismantling his own certainties brick by brick. This new information did not require fresh grief. It required action. Keep this between us until I say otherwise. Post 2 of your men outside Fentress's door, not my household guard, yours. I don't want palace staff seeing the colors and drawing conclusions before I'm ready. And Celine? A pause. She stays comfortable. She stays unaware. She stays exactly where she is until I decide how to use what we know. He looked at Soren directly. Can you hold that? Yes. Good. He moved past him down the corridor, armor weight settling across his shoulders with the familiarity of a second skin. Come to me at the second bell tonight. Bring the full correspondence, not the selection. I want to read everything. Soren was already moving in the opposite direction, efficient and silent, the way useful men move when they understand their assignment. Serath kept walking. Rath, here is the thing about a man like Serath Draxen that takes time to understand and longer to respect. He was not a simple predator. Simple predators react. They are governed by the proximity of threat and the availability of prey and the satisfying directness of an uncomplicated response. What made Serath dangerous in a way that outlasted most rulers of his era was something different: the capacity to absorb devastating information without letting it drive the next decision, to feel the full force of a blow and still choose the ground from which to answer it. It wasn't coldness. It was a kind of terrible patience, trained into him by the harshest available curriculum, which was the real world. The question is what that training costs, because nothing is free. Every discipline is built on something suppressed, and the things you suppress don't disappear. They migrate. They find the rooms in you that you keep unlocked, and they accumulate there, and eventually the door on one of those rooms stops holding, and everything you stored comes back out. Serath had stored a great many things over 18 years of rule. Some of them had already come back out recently, in the form of a letter with 3 paragraphs and a last line about learning a language. The rest were still in the rooms, but the doors were rattling. He found Kavan in the lower yard supervising the escort detail's departure. The palace guard was mounted and moving, 12 riders in the king's colors, heading northeast at a pace that would put them on the Halveth Road before nightfall. Kavan watched them go with the expression of a man who had performed the calculation and found the numbers acceptable. How long to the queen's position? Serath asked, coming up beside him. At that pace, 4 hours, maybe less if the road is dry past the ridge. Kavan didn't look at him. They stood side by side, watching the riders clear the gate. She'll be in a position of safety before second bell. And the rider I sent, has he reached her yet? Not yet. He left after the escort. She'll see the escort first. Serath thought about that. A woman on a northeast road who had negotiated with armed men through a carriage window, steady and unhurried, was now going to see 12 palace riders coming toward her in the king's colors. He wondered what she'd do. He found, without surprise, that he had a very clear picture of what she'd do. She would not panic, and she would not retreat, and she would not immediately assume the riders were threat rather than protection. She would assess. She would watch the formation and the pace and the colors, and then she would make a decision based on available information, which was what she always did, which was something he had watched her do for 8 years without once thinking to tell her that he saw it. When the personal rider reaches her, he said, I want the message delivered verbatim, not paraphrased, the exact words. Kavan nodded. He had the message. He'd written it down himself at the king's dictation 30 minutes ago, which had been an unusual enough thing that he'd kept his face carefully neutral throughout. Verbatim. Yes, my king. Good. A beat. And the Fentress riders, the ones from the Halveth Road. Detained, 12 men. housed in the outer garrison, not the palace cells. They don't know yet why they're held. Keep them comfortable and confused. I want them thinking it's a border regulation matter, nothing that implies the king knows the crest they were wearing. Kavan turned to look at him then. It was a brief look, the kind that contained more than it displayed. You're building the cage before you close the door. I'm building several cages, Serath said. The challenge is making sure the occupants walk into them without being pushed. He left Kavan in the yard. The palace evening settled in around him as he moved through its corridors. The shift of staff from day duties to night ones, the smell of the kitchens coming up through the stone, the particular quality of torchlight that made the obsidian walls take on a warmth they didn't possess in daylight. This was the palace Neris had lived in for 8 years. These were the corridors she had learned to navigate with the careful competence of a woman who understood that belonging to a place and being at home in it were not always the same thing. She had made it as much hers as it would allow. The garden room, her arrangements of the staff schedules, the small adjustments to household routine that nobody noticed until they were gone. He was noticing them now. The kitchen sent up a dinner he ate at the war table with maps in front of him, and Soren's partial report read twice through. The food tasted like nothing in particular. He ate it anyway because he had learned, very young, that a body running on inadequate fuel makes worse decisions, and there were no worse decisions available to him right now than the ones a depleted man might make. At the second bell, Soren arrived. He set the full correspondence on the table without ceremony, a thick sheaf of pages organized by date, each one a letter in Halcrest's hand written to the proxy in Sundreep, and the decoded responses that Soren's team had worked backward from intercepted merchant communications over the preceding weeks. Serath read. He read for 2 hours, methodically, the way he read battle maps, not for individual details, but for the shape of the whole, the logic of the design, the points where the strategy would be most vulnerable. The shape, once fully visible, was admirable in its construction. He could acknowledge that because he was past the point where admiration implied anything personal. Celine had returned to Vareth not on impulse, not as the restoration of a thwarted past, but as the culmination of a plan that had begun with identifying the fault lines in his court and selecting the most efficient entry point. The Eastern Bloodline Coalition wanted Vareth's mountain passes for trade route control. They did not need the whole empire. They needed a governance arrangement that would grant them access while maintaining the empire's functional structure. A new queen, one already allied with their interests, positioned beside a king who believed he was making a personal choice, was an elegant solution. More elegant than invasion. Cheaper. Less likely to produce the kind of unifying resistance that external military pressure tends to create. It was, Serath thought, reading the last page, almost beautiful in its patience. 18 months of letter writing, proxy arrangements, court positioning. Celine had walked back into this palace not as a woman with unresolved feelings, but as a professional, and she had been so confident in her read of him, his isolation, his controlled exterior, his unresolved history with her, that she had moved efficiently and without visible urgency, the way people move when they believe the outcome is already determined. She had miscalculated one thing. She had not accounted for Neris leaving, not the leaving itself. That could have been absorbed and even used. A destabilized king being easier to redirect. What she had not accounted for was what the leaving revealed, what it cracked open, what it forced him to look at inside himself that he had successfully avoided for 18 years. Because a man running on controlled certainty, processing the world through the machinery of authority and necessity, is a man who can be read and therefore managed. A man who has been shaken down to something more honest is a different problem entirely. He no longer responds to the stimuli you've mapped. Serath set the last page down. Enough, he said, and meant it in several directions at once. He told Soren what he was going to do next. Soren listened without interrupting, which was a form of professionalism Serath appreciated. When the king finished, Soren was quiet for a moment, then said, "The timing is narrow." "I know. If she suspects before you've secured Halcrest's cooperation, she'll move to the coalition contact and the correspondence chain goes dark. Which is why Halcrest moves first." Serath stood, rolling the tension from his shoulders with the automatic gesture of a man reclaiming his body from a long session of stillness. "Tomorrow morning, before the council session, I want 30 minutes with him alone before he enters that room." "He'll lie." "Of course he'll lie. I want to hear which lie he chooses. That will tell me how much he actually knows versus how much he suspects. A pause. Have my armor brought at the 6th bell tomorrow. And tell the kitchen I'll want food before the council session, not after. I don't like conducting difficult conversations on an empty stomach. Soren almost smiled. Yes, my king. He left. Serath remained at the war table for another hour, not reading, not planning, just sitting with the shape of what the next 2 days required. At some point, the fire burned low enough that the room grew cold, and he remained in the cold, and he thought about a small boy tracing river routes without touching the surface of the map. At the 4th bell, he slept. 4 hours, which was all he had ever needed, and it was a skill he was grateful for, because it meant his body could sustain pace through extended operations without degrading his thinking, which was the thing that actually kept people alive in complicated situations. He woke before the 6th bell, dressed in plain clothes, and went to the training yard alone in the dark, while the palace slept around him. He did not bring a sword this time. He walked the perimeter of the yard in the cold and thought through every conversation he intended to have that day, every branching possibility, every place where the other party might find unexpected leverage, and what he would do about it. This was the actual work of leadership, not the speeches, not the signatures on dispatches, the private, unglamorous preparation in the dark, running scenarios, finding your own weaknesses before someone else does. He found 3 places in his plan where he was operating on assumption rather than confirmed intelligence. He made note of them, identified what information would resolve each one, and assigned Soren the task in his head before the man had arrived. The 6th bell came. His armor was brought. And then the 7th bell, and Minister Halcrest's chambers, and the knock on the door that a man of Halcrest's precise social calibration would recognize immediately as different from a servant's knock. Halcrest opened the door in his morning robe. He was a man who prided himself on composure, and to his credit, the composure arrived quickly. My king, this is an unexpected honor. He stepped back from the doorway, beginning the instinctive assessment that was his primary survival mechanism. What does this mean? What does he know? What does he want? Serath walked past him into the chamber. It was a minister's room, lived in and organized, a man of administration visible in every surface, books arranged by system, correspondence stacked, a cold fireplace from a night that had not included a fire because Halcrest was also a man of documented frugality, which Serath had always taken as a virtue, and now understood might also have been practicality. You keep your expenses modest when you are moving resources through proxy accounts in Sundreep. Sit down, Halcrest, he said. Not a request. Halcrest sat. Serath remained standing, which was deliberate, not dominance for its own sake, but because a man who is standing is a man who can move, and movement is information, and the removal of information from an adversary is a small but useful advantage. You want to ask me something, Halcrest said, because he was not stupid, and pretending otherwise would have been an error of strategy. I want to ask you several things. The order in which I ask them will tell you something about how much I already know. Serath looked at him steadily. The first question is this. How long have you understood that Lady Celine's interest in returning to Vareth extended beyond personal matters? Halcrest was still. Behind the stillness, Serath watched the assessment engine running. How much? From where? How to calibrate the response. My king, I'm not sure I follow. That's the wrong choice, Serath said, quietly, without theater. The quietness was the thing that landed, that pressed against Halcrest's measured composure and found the edge of it. Try again. A long beat. Halcrest's hands, which had been resting easily on the arms of his chair, shifted. Just slightly. A micro-movement of a man recalibrating his available options and finding fewer than he expected. Approximately, he said, 3 months before her return, I received a preliminary communication through a trade contact in Sundreep. And you didn't bring it to me. I was assessing whether it constituted a credible development. For 3 months. The political situation was, you were measuring which side of the outcome served your position better. Serath said it without inflection. Halcrest flinched slightly, which was a more honest reaction than anything he'd said yet. I'm not here to assign blame, Halcrest. I'm here to offer you a very narrow window, and the window is only available right now, in this room, before the council session. He looked at the man and allowed him to feel the full weight of that gaze, which was the weight of a man who has decided something and is giving you one opportunity to be on the right side of the decision. Tell me everything you know, not the edited version, not the version where you minimize your own involvement, everything. And in exchange, what you've done becomes a matter of private record rather than public treason. The word treason occupied the room. Halcrest was a careful man. He had survived by being careful. And a careful man, when presented with the mathematics of his situation, does the arithmetic. There are names, he said, beyond what I wrote through the proxy. Names in this palace? Names in this palace, and names in 2 of the Eastern bloodline houses that have not yet been identified in any open report. A pause. And there is a timing element I did not include in the correspondence. A scheduled contact. Someone from the coalition is coming to Serath within the week. Serath absorbed this. Under what cover? A trade delegation. Sundreep grain negotiation. It's been scheduled through the Treasury office for 2 weeks. It would not appear unusual. Halcrest met his eyes, and there was something in the look that was not quite shame and not quite relief, but something between the expression of a man who has been carrying a weight and is finally, under the most complicated possible circumstances, setting it down. My king, for what it's worth, I was never told the plan extended to the Queen, to Prince Aeron, what happened on the Halveth Road. That was Fentress acting outside the arrangement. Outside the arrangement you participated in. Yes. No equivocation. Yes. Serath studied him for a moment. Then he pulled a chair from the desk and sat down across from Halcrest, and the dynamic shifted from standing king to seated man, and the shift was deliberate because what came next required a different register. Here is what you're going to do today. You're going to attend the council session. You're going to behave exactly as you would behave if this conversation had not occurred. You're going to watch Celine's household contacts, and you're going to tell me, through Soren, of any communication that occurs between now and the end of the week. And when the trade delegation arrives, you're going to receive them with your usual efficiency and give me the names of every member of that delegation before they enter the palace gates. Halcrest nodded. He was doing the arithmetic. He understood that he had traded a large leverage for a smaller one, and that the smaller one was all that stood between him and consequences he had spent 3 months trying to avoid. And my position is secure, provided you give me no further reason to revisit this conversation. Serath stood, replaced the chair. Halcrest. He looked at him one last time. You are not the first man who mistook the stability of his position for the permanence of his loyalty, but most men who make that mistake don't get a second page. He walked to the door. Don't waste yours. He left Halcrest at the cold room with a cold fireplace and the particular silence of a man who has just understood how close to the edge he was standing. The council session was, on its surface, routine. Serath sat at the head of the table and managed it with the contained authority that his council had come to understand was not performance, but nature. Reports. Dispatches. The Eastern Frontier tensions reviewed through the careful, neutral language of Commander Vane, who reported increased clan movement without characterizing it as coordinated, which was either discretion or incomplete intelligence. Minister Idris brought treasury numbers. Someone raised the grain issue again. Serath listened, responded, directed, all of it with the undiminished focus of a man who had slept 4 hours and spent the morning conducting the most significant intelligence-gathering conversation of the current crisis. Halcrest sat 3 chairs down and performed his own role with a competence that was almost impressive. Only someone who already knew the morning's subtext would have noticed the slightly elevated stillness around his eyes, the fractional pause before each of his contributions. Serath noticed. He did not indicate that he noticed. Celine was not at the council session. She was not a council member. She had positioned herself as a presence in the court without an official role, which had been part of the elegance of the design. You can't remove from power someone who holds no formal position. She had been operating in the space between structure and influence, which was, as Serath now fully understood, exactly where she'd been placed. At the close of the session, as ministers gathered papers and chairs scraped back, Lord Commander Vane appeared at Serath's elbow with the particular posture of a man who has information and is waiting for the room to empty enough to deliver it. When the last minister had filed out, Vane spoke. We've had a message from the Halveth garrison captain, he said. Second communication. He wanted to confirm the Queen's safety directly to the command level, not just through the rider system. He paused. She's declined the full escort detail, my king. Serath looked at him. Declined it. She accepted 2 riders as an information relay. She declined the 12 as a formation. Vane had the expression of a man reporting something he finds personally inconvenient. The garrison captain says she was polite about it. Very clear. She said, he checked the written relay. She said, I left one palace. I'm not interested in traveling with a moving version of another. The room was empty now except for the 2 of them. Serath looked at the table. The maps had been removed for the session and the surface was clean polished wood. He found himself looking at its grain. She's all right, he said. Yes, my king. She and the prince are well. They've reached a village called Serath, about 8 leagues past the crossroads. She's arranged accommodation there. Serath. He thought about the map. He knew where Serath was. A coastal approach town, sea-facing, trade roads, enough independent population that a woman arriving with a child and minimal staff would not constitute an event. She had known where she was going. She had planned this with the same economy she brought to everything. Tell the garrison captain to maintain a discreet watching brief, not contact, not escort. Watching. He paused. And to send me condition reports every 2 days. Vane absorbed this. The discretion on his face was the particular kind that a good commander develops around situations involving his king's personal life. Not judgment, not opinion, just the professional understanding that this is not his portion of the problem to solve. Yes, my king. And the personal message you sent with the rider, was it received? I don't know yet. Serath stood. I'll know when I know. He walked from the council room toward the afternoon, and the afternoon was full. 3 meetings with border emissaries. 1 with the Treasury on the Sundreep grain negotiations, which he conducted now with the knowledge of the approaching delegation sitting behind his sternum like a stone. He approved the delegation's arrival, suggested a schedule, proposed lodging in the eastern guest wing rather than the palace interior. It was a small logistical adjustment that would mean their movement through the palace required passing 2 specific checkpoints where Soren's people would be positioned. Nobody in the Treasury meeting thought anything of it. Why would they? It was at the 5th hour of the afternoon, between the 3rd emissary meeting and a debrief with Soren, that he passed the corridor to Celine's chambers. She was standing in the doorway, waiting. He understood, seeing her there, that she had been calculating the hour of his approach based on his predictable daily movement through the palace. She had been resident long enough to have mapped his patterns. The calculation was correct. He was passing at exactly this hour, and she was standing exactly here. And she was looking at him with an expression that had shed the careful layering of her court presentation. What was underneath was more honest, a sharpness, an assessment, a woman taking the measure of a situation that might be shifting in directions she had not fully anticipated. You didn't come last night, she said. I was occupied. You promised me an answer. I did. He stopped. They were 6 feet apart in the corridor, no staff nearby, which told him she had engineered this encounter rather than waiting for the audience she'd been promised. Another tell, a woman operating from certainty would have waited. A woman operating from recalculation moves toward the information gap. The answer requires some conditions I hadn't finished examining yesterday. Her eyes moved across his face. Reading. She was very good at reading. It was one of the genuine things about her underneath the strategic overlay. You know something, she said. I know many things. He kept his voice easy. Which something are you referring to? A pause. The pause itself was information. A genuinely unconcerned person answers that kind of question with a laugh or an expression of confusion. A person running a concealed position hears a needle in the haystack that question represents and instinctively tries to identify it. Celine did neither of those things. She did something more elegant and more revealing. She shifted the ground. I'm referring to the fact that you're standing in this corridor with your armor on at the 5th hour of the afternoon, which you do when you're managing a security situation rather than a political one. She tilted her head. Something has happened. Things happen every day, he said. This is an empire. Serath. And now her voice dropped into a register that was, he recognized, the register she had always used with him when she wanted him to feel that they were operating in a private space, outside the formal language of court, just two people who had known each other long enough to be direct. It was a masterful register. He had responded to it before. I can be an asset to you in this, whatever it is. That's all I've ever been trying to tell you. I came back here because you thought I was ready, he said. Because the intelligence suggested that a man in my particular condition, managed, isolated, carrying unresolved history with you specifically, would be available to a particular kind of proposal. The corridor went very still. Her face did not change dramatically. That was its own kind of information. A genuinely innocent person would have shown more. What her face showed was the micro-adjustment of someone deciding in real time how to respond to exposure, how much to acknowledge, how much to deny, which posture was still recoverable. I don't know what you mean, she said. Yes, you do. He said it simply, without heat. And I'm not having this conversation in a corridor, Celine. Go to your chambers. Stay there. You'll be given every comfort and no restriction of movement within the palace for the next 2 days, and then we'll talk properly, with appropriate witnesses. He looked at her with the full, undecorated clarity of a man who has done his reading and knows exactly what chapter he's on. That's not a request. He walked past her. Behind him, she did not call after him. She did not make a scene. She was too intelligent for that, and too uncertain now of her ground. He heard the door to her chambers close, quietly, controlled, the door of a woman recalculating. At the second bell of the evening, a rider arrived from Selvath. He was brought to Serath in the war chamber, rode dirty and tired, and he produced a sealed letter from his interior coat pocket, with the careful handling of a man who understands that what he carries matters more than he does. Serath took the letter. He opened it. It was Neris's handwriting. He recognized it in the same instant that he recognized the particular quality of stillness that settled over him when he saw it. The thing his body did when something significant arrived without announcement. It was not a long letter. She had never used more words than the situation required. He read it once. Then he set it on the table and looked at the fire. The letter did not say what he had hoped. She was not returning. She did not ask him to come to her. She did not offer reunion or reconciliation or the particular grace of an outcome that would have let him resolve everything at once. She acknowledged the escort riders. She acknowledged his message, which had told her about the Halveth roadmen, and that he understood they were not random and was handling it. She said, with a directness that was entirely hers and entirely undiluted by the distance between them, that she was glad the investigation was moving. She said that Aaron was well and was watching the ocean from the window of the room they'd taken, and had asked the landlady the names of 3 different birds he'd seen on the cliff face, and had then gone to sleep, happy and full. And then she said one more thing, which was the thing that Serath read twice, and then again, and then left on the table while he looked at the fire. She said, I know what you're doing. I know the shape of how you handle a breach. I know you will dismantle what needs dismantling, and I know you will do it completely, because that is the only way you know how to do anything. I'm not writing this to tell you to stop. I'm writing it because someone should say, when it's done, don't disappear into the aftermath and call it enough. Finishing the war is not the same as knowing what you fought for. He sat with that for a long time. Soren arrived at the 3rd bell with the information about the trade delegation's advance party. 3 members already in Sundreep, scheduled to cross the northern gate in 5 days. Their identities confirmed through intercept. 2 of the names Halcrest had provided. 1 new name that required 2 hours of cross-referencing before Soren's team confirmed the bloodline affiliation. The net was assembling. Everything was moving in the direction it needed to move. The plan had internal logic, and Serath could trace its execution from where he sat, all the way through to the point where Seleni's position became untenable and the coalition's investment in Vareth became a liability they would distance themselves from. He could see the end of it. And Neris's letter sat on the table and asked him what he intended to do when he got there. He picked up the letter, folded it, put it in the interior pocket of his coat, against his chest. He would answer it. Not tonight. Not with the current chapter still in motion. But he would answer it, and the answer would not be tactical, and it would not be managed, and it would not arrive in the language he had been using for 18 years to keep the important things behind glass where they couldn't be damaged. He didn't know yet exactly what language it would be in. He was still learning it. That was an uncomfortable admission for a man who had spent the better part of 2 decades being certain of everything. He was still sitting with the discomfort of it at the fourth bell when Kavan knocked once and entered without waiting, which was the code between them for information that could not hold. Serath looked up. Kavan's face carried the expression of a man who has already processed the shock of what he's about to say and arrived at the other side of it. "My king," he said, "the Halveth men, the 12 riders we detained. What about them?" "One of them has talked." Kavan came to the table, stood across from his king with the folio in his hands, closed. He asked for private audience with palace command. He had information he said was worth his freedom. And he wasn't acting on Fentress's orders. Kavan set the folio on the table and opened it to a single page with 3 lines of text in Sorin's hand. Fentress was the crest they wore, but the order for the Halveth Road came from inside this palace, through a staff member whose name we have, who received it in writing from a source he identified under questioning as a woman. A woman who gave instructions the night before the queen departed, which means the order was placed before Neris left, not after. The fire in the grate, the single page with 3 lines, the weight of a chain of logic extending backward in time through the orderly sequence of events, until it reached a point that changed the shape of everything. Serath looked at the 3 lines. He already knew the name at the end of the chain before he read it, because there was only one name it could be, and the logic had been pointing there since the moment he'd read Sorin's folio the night before. But reading a name you have already concluded and reading confirmation of that name are different things. And the difference lives in the body rather than the mind, a physical acknowledgement that the thing you suspected is the thing that is true. Celine had known Neris was leaving before Neris left, had known because she had been watching, had known because she had resources in the palace staff that he had not yet fully mapped, had known and had placed the men on the Halveth Road not as a response to the queen's departure, but as a preemptive measure, a failsafe, a way to ensure that if the queen left and took the air and was not immediately retrieved, she could be used, held as leverage. A queen outside the palace with the king's son was a queen who could be the instrument of pressure, of negotiation, of the particular kind of political coercion that doesn't require an army. Neris and Aaron had not been inconveniences to be managed. They had been planned for. The letter in his interior pocket against his chest felt, in this moment, like it had weight beyond paper. Serath closed the folio. He stood. He looked at Kavan, who was watching him with the particular alertness of a soldier who is reading the ground for what comes next, who understands that what his king does in the next 30 seconds will determine the shape of the next several days. "Wake Sorin," Serath said. His voice was without heat, without volume, without anything that sounded like the feeling that was currently moving through him, which was a cold and very clear fury that had nothing impulsive about it, that was in fact so far past impulsive that it had arrived somewhere on the other side in the territory of absolute decision. "Bring him here. Then bring me Lady Celine Morvain under escort, and this time it is not a request. And she does not get 30 seconds to prepare a response, and she does not get to choose whether she comes." Kavan's jaw set. "Yes, my king." "And Kavan," the general paused at the door. "After that, I need a rider to Selvath, not a military rider, a personal one." He looked at the closed folio on the table. "Tonight." Kavan looked at him for one moment with something in his face that was, from a man of his restraint, the equivalent of a very long statement. "Yes, my king," he said again, and this time the words carried something warmer inside them that he would not name aloud and didn't need to. The door closed. Serath reached into his interior pocket and put his hand on the folded letter without taking it out. Held it there for a moment, the paper and the words inside it, the handwriting of a woman who had taken her son to a coastal village and watched him name birds and go to sleep happy, while Serath had spent the same night building nets for people who had tried to use them both. He took his hand away from the letter. There were things that needed doing first, the kind of things he was built for, the kind of reckoning that moved through formal structure and evidence and decisive action. He knew how to do those things. He had always known how to do those things. The letter was asking him something harder. The door at the end of the corridor opened. He heard footsteps, the measured sound of palace guard, and beneath it, the lighter, more controlled sound of a woman who had been given no choice about this particular escort and had decided, in the absence of choice, to walk as if she had chosen it. Celine was coming. And the conversation that followed would decide the shape of everything. Not just the political future of Verith, not just the fate of the coalition's eastern ambitions, but the specific question of whether a king who had spent 18 years choosing the language of necessity over the language of truth had enough of the second language left in him to say what he needed to say to a woman watching the ocean from a cliffside window 8 leagues northeast. The footsteps reached the door. He straightened. The armor weight settled across his shoulders. He was not afraid of the conversation with Celine. He had been in harder rooms. He was afraid of the letter he would have to write afterward, and the honesty it required, and the fact that for the first time in a very long time, the outcome was not his to command. He was afraid, and he was going to do it anyway. The door opened. She walked in the way Serath had expected her to walk, composed, spine straight, the escort of 4 palace guard rendered invisible by the simple act of moving as though she had chosen to be here. It was a masterclass in the performance of unbothered authority, and he watched it with the particular attention of someone who had been studying its mechanics for weeks and could now see the scaffolding underneath. Celine came to the center of the war chamber and stopped. She did not sit. He had not offered her a chair, and she understood the language of that omission too well to make the error of sitting anyway. Soren stood to the left of the table. Kavan was at the door. The 2 palace guard remained in the corridor outside, visible through the open frame. Celine looked at Serath. Her face carried the composed surface of a woman who has prepared for several versions of this conversation and is deciding, in real time, which preparation applies. "You could have sent a message," she said. "I would have come." "I know you would have." He looked at her without the performance of anger, without the theater of accusation. Just the direct, undecorated attention of a man who has already finished being surprised. "That's not why I sent an escort." "Then why?" "Because a message gives you transit time. Transit time gives a person the opportunity to make decisions about what travels with them and what doesn't." He moved to the table. Soren had laid the relevant correspondence in a loose arrangement. Not a full display, not everything, just enough. "Sit down, Celine." This time she sat. And the fact that she sat, without protest, without a pointed comment about the instruction, told him that she had arrived at the same conclusion he'd arrived at hours earlier. The ground had shifted enough that the posture of unassailable confidence was no longer the most useful tool available. There is a specific quality to the silence that exists between 2 people when one of them knows significantly more than the other thinks they know. It has texture. It presses. Serath had been on both sides of that silence in his career, and he understood that the longer it extended, the more it did his work for him. He let it run for 12 full seconds. He counted, watching her face with the attention of someone reading fine print. Then he placed one sheet of the correspondence in front of her. The sheet that named her. Halcrest's hand, dated 7 months prior. She looked at it for a moment. "That's Halcrest's correspondence," she said. "It is. He's been conducting correspondence with outside parties for 18 months. Yes, I've read all of it." Serath pulled out the chair across from her and sat, which changed the dynamic again. Not the standing king, not the formal authority architecture. Just 2 people at a table with a piece of paper between them. "I'm not interested in watching you work through the available strategies, Celine. We've known each other too long for that to be an interesting conversation." He leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table, hands loosely together. "The men on the Halveth Road. Tell me when that order was placed." The silence this time was a different texture, shorter. She made the calculation he'd known she would make, which was the calculation of a genuinely intelligent person determining that partial disclosure offered in the framing of cooperation was the least catastrophic available option. "The night before she left," Celine said. "Before she left," Serath repeated, flat. "Which means you knew she was leaving before she left." "I had information that suggested..." "From where?" "A staff member, a woman in the domestic household who was on your payroll." A pause. "Who shared information with me?" "Yes." Serath looked at her for a long time. He was doing the thing he had trained himself to do in situations that required the suppression of immediate response. He was breathing evenly and looking at the person across from him and letting the full scope of what they had just confirmed settle into place like a stone settling through water, disturbing everything on the way down and then coming to rest at the bottom where the real ground was. Celine had known Neris was going to leave. had placed armed men on the road she would travel, had designed a situation in which the queen and the heir, once outside the protection of the palace, could be held. Not harmed, probably. Harm would have been a miscalculation. It would have created the wrong kind of political crisis. But held. Used. Made into a pressure point against a king who was supposed to be, by this stage of the plan, moving willingly in Celine's direction. The plan had assumed a king who was emotionally compromised, politically isolated, and grateful for the apparent stability she was offering. It had not accounted for Soren's file. It had not accounted for Halcrest's arithmetic. And it had not accounted for the 3 days of interior reckoning that Serath had done while everyone around him was watching for external fracture and missing the internal reconstruction. Here is the thing about betrayal that no one adequately prepares you for. It is not the act itself that destroys something. It is the retroactive revision. The moment you understand the shape of a betrayal, every memory involving the betrayer undergoes instant reinterpretation, every conversation replaying in the new light, every gesture reassigned its actual meaning. A man can absorb a single blow. What undoes him is having to re-understand everything he thought was real. It is an enormous cognitive and emotional labor, and it happens simultaneously, and it is exhausting in a way that no external battle has ever been. Serath had started that labor the night he read Soren's folio. He had enough of it completed by this hour in this room that what he felt looking at Celine was not the raw devastation of fresh betrayal. It was something colder and more final. The feeling of a man who has done the accounting and arrived at the full number. "The coalition's delegation," he said. "When they arrive, what was the plan?" Celine looked at him for a moment, measuring. Then she said, "By the time they arrived, the situation was meant to be resolved. You would have accepted the partnership I proposed. The delegation would have formalized the arrangement under the cover of trade negotiation. The passes would have been open to Eastern route access under a treaty that maintained Vareth's nominal sovereignty while creating a functional dependent relationship." She said it cleanly, without apology, in the voice of someone describing a mechanism rather than a moral position. It was not designed to destroy Vareth. It was designed to stabilize it within a larger economic structure. Under their terms. Under negotiated terms. Negotiated by you. On behalf of people who are paying for your presence in this palace. He watched her face. Not political geometry, Celine. A transaction. Something crossed her face then. The first thing he'd seen from her that wasn't managed. It was not guilt, because guilt requires a moral framework that this particular context had eroded past recognition for her. It was something more complicated. The expression of a person who had been operating in the vocabulary of strategic necessity for so long that they had lost access to the other vocabulary and could only watch from a distance as someone else named what they'd done in the simpler language of ordinary human betrayal. "You want me to say I'm sorry," she said. "I want you to be accurate," he said. "What you were sorry for and what you weren't are your business. What you did is mine." Soren moved, just slightly, adjusting his position near the wall, the small motion of a man whose king has just closed a door he didn't realize was still open. "What happens now?" Celine said. "Now," Serath said, "you are going to stay in your chambers, comfortable and secure and closely watched, while I manage the arrival of your coalition's delegation in a way that ensures they understand that the arrangement they were expecting has been dissolved." He stood. "After that, there will be a formal review. I'll make that process as private as your cooperation warrants." She looked up at him. "And if I don't cooperate, then I make it public." He said it without heat. It was not a threat. It was a description of available options, delivered with the professional detachment of a man who has already decided that the outcome serves him either way. "Your choice." Celine sat in the chair with the correspondence in front of her and the two soldiers visible through the open door, and she did the thing that Serath had watched intelligent people do when they arrived at the outer boundary of their options. She went very still, and she looked at the middle distance, and she did the arithmetic one more time, and she arrived at the same answer. "I'll cooperate," she said. He left her to Soren's management and walked into the corridor, and the door closed behind him, and the palace night moved around him in its usual rhythms, entirely unaware that the shape of the next week had just been determined in a room lit by a low fire. He should have felt something clean, relief maybe, or the particular satisfaction of a plan arriving at its intended destination. He felt neither of those things. What he felt was tired, and underneath the tiredness, something that was not quite sadness and not quite anger and not quite the word for what happens when you understand fully, for the first time, the cost of the life you've been living. He went to the war chamber. He sat. He took the letter from his interior pocket, opened it, and read it one more time by the light of the iron lamp on the table. Then he picked up the pen that lived beside the campaign maps and pulled a clean sheet toward him. He wrote for 20 minutes. He did not draft first. He had spent, he calculated, approximately 18 years not saying what needed saying, and the arrears on that account were considerable, but he was a man who, when he finally committed to a direction, moved at pace, and tonight was the night for that particular direction. He sealed the letter, called for a writer, gave the instruction he had told Kavan he would give. Then he went to sleep. He slept 5 hours, which was more than he'd managed in 3 days. And when he woke, the palace was dark, and the 4th bell had just sounded, and something in his chest was different. Not resolved, not healed, but different. The way a wound is different in the morning, when the first clean air has had time to reach it. The days that followed moved fast in the way that complex operations move. The surface appearing calm while the infrastructure underneath runs hot. Soren managed Halcrest with the cold efficiency of a man who has an intelligence file the size of a minister's conscience and knows how to use both. The domestic staff member who had relayed Neris's departure plans to Selene was quietly reassigned to an outer province, posting with enough of a raise that the reassignment read as promotion. The Halveth riders remained detained, comfortable and confused, serving their purpose as contained evidence. And the Eastern Trade Delegation crossed the Northern Gate on schedule 4 days after the War Chamber conversation, and was received by Treasury officials with entirely standard ceremony, while Soren's men photographed the arrangement from positions that the delegation would not have identified as observation posts. Serath was not present for the delegation's arrival. This was deliberate. A king's absence at a routine trade meeting required no explanation, but it communicated something that the delegation's leader, a careful man named Vorn, who had the manner of someone accustomed to political precision, would have registered immediately. The king had not elevated this meeting by his presence. The king was managing other priorities. The ground the delegation had planned to walk on had not been prepared in the way their contact had described. Vorn requested a private meeting with the king. He was told the king was occupied. He requested again the following morning. He was told the king was in council. On the 3rd day, Vorn received a formal written response from the palace on treaty-quality paper with the Draxen seal, informing the delegation that Vareth was happy to continue the grain negotiation through the treasury channels, but that certain previously discussed arrangements would not be proceeding, as the parties who had initiated those discussions were no longer representing Varethi interests. It was the most diplomatic version of a cage door closing that Serath had ever composed. Vorn was in his carriage by nightfall. The coalition's 18 months of patient architecture, their careful placement of an agent, their meticulous construction of a plan designed to make a king believe he was making free choices, it came down, in the end, to a carriage moving south through a palace gate, while the torches burned and nobody came to see them off. Serath watched from the 4th-level window. He felt nothing dramatic about it. The work was finished. The mechanism had been dismantled. What he felt was the quiet of a field after a battle, which is not peace. It is exhaustion and damage in the temporary absence of further attack. He turned from the window, and then the messenger arrived. Not a rider from Selvath, not the regular condition report that Kavan's Eastern Garrison relay had been producing every 2 days. A different messenger, a palace domestic, young, clearly uncomfortable, carrying a folded note with the wide-eyed expression of someone who has been given a job without being told the full context. The note was from Soren. It was 2 lines, in Soren's compressed intelligence shorthand that Serath had learned over years of working together. The first line said, "Second intercept from Halveth Garrison perimeter. A party of 4, not armed, arrived at Selvath overnight. We identify them as a secondary coalition contact team, not the primary delegation. These were not in the original correspondence file. They were held in reserve." The second line said, "They reached Selvath before the garrison watching brief could intercept. Current status of the Queen's position is unconfirmed. The fire in the grate." The 2 lines on the paper. The palace going about its nighttime business in every direction around him, entirely innocent of this particular piece of information and its implications. There are moments in the management of a crisis when all the careful architecture of plan and counterplan collides with the irreducible fact of human unpredictability, and the collision produces something that no intelligence file can fully prepare you for: the understanding that you accounted for every variable you could see, and that there were variables you couldn't see, and that the cost of the invisible ones is borne by the people closest to you before it is borne by you. Serath moved. Not dramatically, not with the theater of emergency, but at the specific pace of a man who has compressed the distance between decision and action to almost nothing. He was down 2 flights of stairs before the young domestic had finished processing the fact that the king had left the room. He was in the lower yard in 4 minutes, and Kavan materialized from the stable end of the yard because Kavan had the instinct of a career soldier and could read urgency in footsteps. "Get me a horse," Serath said. "Not an escort, not a formation. 1 horse and road provisions for 4 days." Kavan stood in the torchlight and looked at his king for one long measuring moment. Not questioning the decision, Kavan did not question decisions of this kind in this tone, but absorbing the full weight of what was being asked and what it meant. A king riding out alone toward a coastal village was not a political move. It was not a strategic deployment. It was something older and more basic. A man moving toward the people he should have protected. "The garrison in Selvath," Kavan said carefully. They may have, Serath agreed, "or they may not. I'm not waiting for confirmation." He looked at Kavan directly. "You understand the palace disposition while I'm gone. You know which situations are still active. Sorin has everything he needs to manage the Selene review. Halcrest is contained." He paused. "You've run this before when I've been in the field. You'll run it now." "Yes, my king." A pause that contained volumes. "And if someone asks where the king has gone, tell them the king is attending to a personal matter northeast of the capital and will return within the week. That is the precise truth." He held Kavan's gaze. "It will probably be the most honest thing the palace has been told about my movements in 18 years. Kavan looked at him. Something in the general's face shifted into the territory of an expression he never allowed himself in official capacity. Something that was warm and complicated and constituted a kind of recognition that one man offers another when he sees him doing something that costs him personally, but is correct in a way that formal language cannot quite contain. "The road past Halveth Crossroads is clear," Kavan said, already moving toward the stable. "The ridge is frozen, but passable. You'll want to stay south of the tree line after the second marker. The north path ices badly before dawn." "I know the road," Serath said. "Yes, my king," Kavan said, and that was the last formal thing either of them said in that exchange. The horse was ready in 11 minutes. Serath rode out of the northern gate in plain clothes and a heavy road cloak, the iron crown absent, the armor absent, the machinery of the empire visible in the torchlight behind him and diminishing in the road behind as he put distance between himself and it. The stars above the Varethi peaks were extraordinarily clear in the way they get, in deep cold, sharp and crowded and indifferent to everything happening below them. He rode. This is the thing about power that nobody who wields it will say plainly: it is a form of captivity. Not in the way that powerless people are captive, with external walls and imposed limits, but in its own way with the internal walls of expectation and the imposed limit of never being permitted to be simply a person, without the weight of everything you carry attached to every breath. Serath had not been a person without the weight for 18 years. He had barely noticed its absence. You adapt to what you carry, and then you forget what it felt like to put it down. And eventually you cannot imagine existing without it. And you call that integration when actually it is something closer to consumption. The road northeast unrolled under the horse's feet. The cold was significant, and he rode through it without ceremony. At the Halveth Crossroads he paused, looked at the ground in the torchlight he carried, and thought about a carriage window and a woman negotiating through it with a steady voice while armed men waited outside. He thought about that for a long moment. Then he rode on. He made the Selvath approach at the gray edge of dawn, the sea smell arriving before the village did. Salt and cold water, and the particular cleanness of coastal air that has traveled a long distance over open water. The village came into view as the sky lightened, a compact arrangement of stone buildings on a cliff road, fishing boats visible in the harbor below. A small market square still quiet in the early hour. He found the garrison watch position first. 2 soldiers on a ridgeline above the village who straightened sharply when they recognized what they were looking at, and had the confused discipline of men who understand that a king arriving unannounced at a watch position is an event for which they have no prepared response. "Report," Serath said. He did not dismount. The senior of the two soldiers, a hard-faced woman of about 40 with the posture of a frontier veteran, gave it directly. The secondary contact team had arrived in Selvath 2 nights prior, presenting as traveling merchants. They had taken rooms at the main inn. One of them had made contact with the landlady of the property where the queen was staying, inquiring about a guest, which was not unusual. What was unusual was the follow-up inquiry, which had asked specifically about the presence of a child. The landlady, who was apparently a woman of native suspicion regarding strangers asking about other people's children, had told them nothing and had quietly locked the property door and sent her daughter to the garrison post with a message. "They didn't get to her," the soldier said. "Where are they now?" "2 detained at the inn. 2 others we haven't located yet. We've been holding until command direction on how to proceed." He dismounted. "Hold the 2 you have. The other 2, work the village contacts. They'll be somewhere local. Don't move on the Queen's location until I've been there first." He looked at the soldier directly. "Nobody moves on that property without my direct instruction. Is that clear?" "Yes, sir." The soldier did not call him my king. She called him sir, with the directness of a frontier veteran who ranks function above ceremony. He found it appropriately honest. He walked the rest of the way into the village alone, leaving the horse with the garrison and proceeding on foot through the morning streets, which were beginning to show the first signs of daily life. A baker opening, a fisherman heading down the hill path toward the harbor, a dog investigating something at the base of a market stall. None of them paid particular attention to the broad-shouldered man in the plain road cloak moving through their streets, which was exactly the right response. He looked like a traveler who had ridden through the night. He was. He found the property on the east side of the village, 3 buildings down from the harbor overlook, identifiable by the 2 riding horses stabled outside that were too well bred for the neighborhood without being obviously military. The landlady's daughter had noted those horses in her garrison message. Soren had noted them in his relay. Serath noted them now with the satisfaction of confirmed intelligence. He knocked. There was a delay. The household waking up, a voice inside, the sound of movement. Then the door opened and the landlady appeared, a compact woman of 60 with the face of someone who has been running a property on a coastal road for a long time and has seen most categories of visitor. She looked at him. He looked at her. "I'm here for my wife and my son," he said. He said it plainly because there was no other way to say it. "My name is Serath. She'll know what that means." The landlady studied him for a moment with an assessment that reminded him, briefly and painfully, of the assessment he'd seen in Neris's face the last time she had looked at him in this palace. It was the look of a person deciding whether the presented information is trustworthy. The landlady made her decision in about 4 seconds, which was either an excellent read of character or an indication that she had heard his name in the preceding days and had already formed a view. She stepped back from the door. "2nd floor," she said. "End of the hall. She's up. The boy sleeps late." He walked through the property, which was small and clean and smelled of salt air and wood smoke. Up the stairs, down the hall. He stood at the door at the end. He did not know what he was going to say. That was genuinely true. And for a man who had spent his entire adult life knowing what he was going to say before he opened his mouth, the experience of arriving at a door with nothing prepared was disorienting in a way that was also, underneath the disorientation, something like relief. You cannot perform the truth. You can only arrive at it. Every structure you've built to manage other people's perceptions of you, every layer of control and composed authority and deliberate presentation, none of it functions at a door like this one, in a village 8 leagues from your empire, in plain clothes at dawn. He knocked. A pause. Footsteps. The quality of the silence on the other side of the door changed, and he understood that she had looked at it for a moment before opening it, and that she had decided something in that moment. The door opened. Neris stood in the frame. She was wearing a plain house robe, her dark hair loose, no jewelry, and she looked exactly like herself, which was to say nothing like the queen she had been required to perform in the palace, and exactly like the person he had watched read in the garden room on a Tuesday afternoon 8 months ago and had not bothered to stop and understand. She looked at him with the clear, dark eyes that had always seen more than he'd given them credit for, and she did not say anything immediately. And he did not say anything immediately, and the sea wind moved through the hall from the window at the far end. "You came alone," she said finally. "Yes." She looked at him, at the road cloak and the plain clothes and the absence of any of the architecture of authority that normally surrounded him. Reading. She had always read him better than he'd been willing to acknowledge. "The coalition's delegation," she said. "Is it handled?" "It's handled." "Celine." "Contained. Under formal review." A pause. "She knew you were leaving before you left. She placed the men on the Halveth Road herself." Something moved across Neris's face. Not surprise. He had the sense she had already worked out most of the shape of it, from the road and the evidence of the stop itself. But acknowledgement. The particular expression of someone who suspected something dark and has now had it confirmed. "She was never here for you," Neris said. "No. I thought—" She stopped. "I thought it was something personal, something I couldn't compete with. The history, the—" She made a small gesture with one hand, dismissing the incomplete sentence. "I didn't know it was business." "Neither did I. Not at first." He looked at her steadily. "I was stupid about her. I want to be accurate about that. I'm not asking you to take that away from the accounting." Neris looked at him for a long moment. The sea wind came through the hall again. Down the corridor, the window rattled gently in its frame. "Why are you here, Serath?" she said, not with coldness, with the directness of a woman who has earned the right to plain questions. He had ridden 8 leagues in the dark to stand at this door, and he had written a letter the night before that had said most of what needed saying, and she had presumably read it, and all of that was true and also entirely insufficient for what this moment was. He understood, standing there, that the letter was preparation but not replacement, that the actual thing required presence, required him to stand somewhere unfamiliar, without armor and without the apparatus of everything he commanded, and say the true thing out loud in the regular air. "I'm here," he said, "because I understand what I had, and I understand that I treated it as if it would stay without being tended, and I understand that was wrong in a way that no political resolution covers." He looked at her and did not look away. "I'm not here to tell you what to do. I'm here because I needed you to see that I came. That's all I'm asking for you to see it." She looked at him. Something in her face did something complicated. Not melting, not the easy resolution of a long tension, but the harder movement of a person confronting evidence that doesn't fit the conclusion they'd already drawn. She had drawn that conclusion on a northeast road, in the dark, with good reason. He was not asking her to unmake it. He was asking only to be seen in this moment, which was different from being forgiven and different from being taken back, and was the only honest thing he had available to offer. "Aaron asked about you," she said finally. Her voice was careful, neutral in the way that careful people are neutral when they're keeping something very large behind the neutrality. "Yesterday. He woke up and watched the birds on the cliff for a while, and then he asked if you knew where we were." Serath felt something happen in his chest that was physical and real and not managed and did not need to be. "What did you tell him?" he said. "I told him you would." Her eyes held his without deflection. "I told him that his father always found out what he needed to know." A door down the hall opened. A small figure appeared, sleep-creased, green wool-clad despite it being indoors. The dark eyes that were unambiguously his mother's, and the jaw that was unambiguously his father's, and the particular expression of a 7-year-old who has processed an enormous amount of disruption and has arrived at a state of watchful calm that was, in its way, more adult than most adults managed. Aaron looked at his father. Serath looked at his son. The boy did not run. He walked, which was a 7-year-old's version of the kind of measured approach that his father had spent a lifetime cultivating, and he stopped 2 feet away and looked up with those clear dark eyes, assessing. "You found us," Aaron said. "I found you," Serath said. A pause. Then Aaron reached out and put one hand on the road cloak at Serath's forearm. Not a hug, not a demand, just the contact of a child reestablishing something he needed to confirm was real, and then something that the Empire had no mechanism for, no language for, no protocol for. The King of Vareth crouched down in the hallway of a coastal boarding house to be at his son's eye level, and stayed there, and said nothing, and the moment did not require anything further from him. Neris watched from the doorway. She did not close the distance. She did not open it. She held her position in the frame with the full complexity of a woman who has survived 8 years of an arrangement that asked everything of her and offered very little back, and who is now looking at evidence that something has shifted, and who understands, because she has always understood the difference between what is performed and what is real, that the man in front of her is not performing. But understanding something and knowing what to do with it are different things, and she was not yet at the second, and she was too honest to pretend otherwise. And then Soren's garrison rider arrived, not at the door, at the end of the street, visible through the hall window, moving at the pace that riders move when the news is significant. Serath saw him from his crouched position, straightened, tracked the rider's destination, and felt the particular interior drop of a man who has managed to reach something personal for the first time in a long time and is now watching the world reassert itself. The landlady appeared at the base of the stairs. "Rider for the guest from the capital," she said, with the inflection of a woman who has understood, over the past 2 days, somewhat more than the guest's anonymity was intended to preserve. Serath moved to the window. The rider reached the property. The message was a sealed relay from Soren, passed through the garrison chain. He broke the seal. 4 lines. He read them. He read them again. And here is where the weight of what breaks became something different. Not the slow accumulation of revealed design, not the retroactive accounting of betrayal already named, but the sudden vertical drop of a new fact that had no precedent in anything he had prepared for. The 4 lines said, "Kavan taken in the lower yard, 8th bell this morning. 3 men, unknown livery. Kavan is alive. They are demanding the release of the 2 detained coalition contacts and safe passage south. If this is not provided by the 2nd bell this afternoon, they have stated they will move to a secondary target. The secondary target named is Prince Aaron, the secondary contact team, the 2 members of the group that the garrison hadn't located yet. They had not stayed in Selvath. They had ridden back. They had ridden back to the palace. They had taken Kavan, and they knew where Aaron was." Serath lowered the message. He looked at the hallway, at Neris still in the doorway, at Aaron standing beside her now, at the morning light coming through the window, at the coastal village that had been, for 2 days, a place of provisional safety and was now something else entirely. The Empire had followed him here. That is the nature of power. It does not stay where you leave it. It does not recognize the distinction between the personal and the political that you attempt to enforce. It moves through every door you open, occupies every room you try to keep clear of it, and eventually asks you to choose, not between options, but between versions of yourself. There are moments that force a man to become something he has not previously been, not better, not worse, different. The compression of an impossible situation against the full weight of everything at stake produces either fracture or transformation, and the line between those 2 outcomes is thinner than most people believe, and it runs directly through the center of what a person is most afraid to lose. Serath Draxen stood in a coastal boarding house hallway 8 leagues from his empire, with a message in his hand that had dismantled every choice he thought he had, and looked at his son, and looked at his wife, and understood that the king he had been until this morning was not capable of navigating what came next, and that the man he had been afraid to be might be the only one who could. He folded the message, put it in his coat, looked at Neris. "I need to tell you what's in this message," he said. "And then I need you to tell me something." She moved from the doorway, fully into the hall, closing the distance. She looked at his face and read the shape of what was in it with the accuracy she had always had, and he had always failed to properly acknowledge. "Tell me," she said. He told her, and the sea wind moved through the hall, and the morning light shifted, and what came next was going to require something from Serath Draxen that no campaign, no conquest, no 18 years of iron rule had ever asked of him. It was going to require him to stop solving the problem and start trusting someone else to solve it with him. That was the hardest thing he had ever been asked to do. He was going to do it anyway. The ride back to Vareth took 4 hours. Serath rode hard through the first 2, then eased the pace through the mountain approach, where the road iced and the horse needed to find its footing on ground that did not announce its instability in advance. The cold was absolute. The sky above the peaks was the color of old iron, the kind of sky that carries winter without apology. He rode through it with the message folded in his coat and Neris's last words still in his ears, And he did not think about the empire or the throne or the coalition or the formal review that was still waiting in the palace administrative record. He thought about what she had said when he told her what was in the message. She had listened to all of it. She had not interrupted. And when he finished, she had looked at him for a moment and then said, quietly and without theater, "Kavan protected us for 8 years. Whatever you need to do, do it, and come back. Come back." Not as a conditional, not as a negotiation. As a fact she was stating in advance, the way people state facts they intend to make true by the force of insisting on them. He had looked at her when she said it, and she had held his gaze with the full steady weight of a woman who had already done the hardest reckoning and was now, on the other side of it, choosing to be present for whatever came next. He had not said everything that needed saying. There wasn't time, there probably wasn't language, not yet, not for all of it. But she had said, "Come back," and he had said, "I will," and those two things were the most honest exchange he had been part of in a very long time, and they would have to carry the weight until there was room for the rest. He left Aaron in the garrison captain's direct care. The captain, the hard-faced frontier veteran who had called him sir without ceremony, had taken the assignment with the flat professionalism of someone who understood the stakes without needing them explained. Neris had kissed Aaron's forehead and told him he was going to stay with the soldiers for a little while and that soldiers were good at keeping people safe. Aaron had looked at the garrison captain, assessed her with those clear dark eyes, and said, "Do you know the names of the birds on the cliff?" The captain had said she knew 2 of them. Aaron had said he knew 4, and he would show her. That had been that. Serath had watched that exchange from the doorway and felt something in his chest that he did not have a name for in any of the languages he had been taught. He rode. The palace came into view on the descent from the ridge as the second bell of the afternoon was still 40 minutes away, which was the window the message had named. He had cut it close, but he had cut it deliberately. Arriving too early gave the detained men time to recalibrate their position, time to assess the king's demeanor and adjust demands. Arriving at the edge of the window arrived with its own pressure, its own implicit message. The king has been moving at speed, which means the king is taking this seriously, which means the king's response is not going to be the response of a man who had time to compose himself into a negotiating posture. Soren was waiting at the northern gate. He had, characteristically, everything organized and nothing visible that announced the organization. "Kavan's status," Serath said, dismounting without ceremony. "Stable. They have him in the lower garrison storage building, the old one near the east wall. 3 men inside with him, 1 at the door. They've made no physical threat beyond the initial restraint." Soren fell into step beside him as he moved through the gate. "They're professionals, not soldiers. They moved efficiently and without collateral disruption. This was planned." "It was planned before Vorn's delegation left," Serath said. "This was the fallback. If the primary arrangement failed, compromise a high-value palace contact and use him as leverage for extraction." He was moving through the lower yard now, and the palace staff were giving him a wide berth in the particular way that staff gives wide berths to kings who are moving at purpose pace and radiating something that is not anger, but is certainly not indifference. "The demand is release of the 2 detained contacts and safe passage south." "Ah, shai chachi ite." "Yes, which I am not going to give them." Soren did not blink. "I assume not, which means the conversation needs to end the situation without fulfilling the demand, without harming Kavan, and without providing the detained contacts with any information about the current disposition of their operation." "Correct." He stopped, looked at Soren. "Can you give me the storage building with no additional personnel visible within line of sight of the door?" Soren thought for approximately 2 seconds. "Yes, the east yard clears naturally at this hour. I can manage the remaining traffic." "Do that." He looked toward the east wall. The storage building was old, stone, functional. 1 door in the front face, no windows on the lower level, a high, narrow vent on the east side that provided air but no egress. He had inspected that building 12 years ago in a security review and remembered the layout the way he remembered most things that were ever operationally relevant, completely, without effort. "I'm going to walk up to that door alone. 1 knock. I want you at the east wall corner outside their sight line with 2 of your people, not armed prominently. You read the room when the door opens. Walk in. And if it doesn't go cleanly..." "It will go cleanly," Serath said. Because they planned this as leverage, not as execution. And people who plan leverage are people who want a negotiation. And in a negotiation, the first thing I need to do is be the most controlled person in the room. He paused. Which I am. Soren looked at him for a moment. Then, yes, my king. The east yard cleared. 3 minutes, smoothly, Soren's people managing the movement without visible urgency. The storage building door sat at the end of 60 feet of open stone yard in the afternoon gray. Serath walked it alone, in the plain road cloak, without armor, without visible weapon, which was its own kind of statement. A king who arrives at your door without armor is either foolish or is telling you something about how he reads the threat level, and these men were professional enough to understand the distinction. He knocked once. A pause. Muffled conversation inside. Then the door opened, and the man at the door was compact, dark-eyed, and holding himself with the particular stillness of someone who is trained and is currently running a calculation about what the person in front of him represents. He had not expected Serath to come alone. That was visible in the half-second recalibration behind his eyes. I'm going to step inside, Serath said, calm, direct. I'm not armed. I came without escort because this conversation doesn't require an audience, and because I want to look at General Kavan and confirm he's well before we talk about anything else. He held the man's gaze. Those are reasonable things. You know they are. The man looked at him for a moment. Then he stepped back from the door. Serath walked in. Kavan was seated against the far wall, his hands bound in front of him with a professional knot that allowed circulation but restricted movement, a bruise developing along his jaw from the initial restraint. He looked at Serath with the expression of a man who is deeply, personally annoyed at his current situation and is controlling it with the discipline of 40 years of military service. Their eyes met. Serath gave him the smallest possible nod. Kavan's expression adjusted by a fraction that meant, I'm fine, I'm functional, proceed. The 3 men inside the building had arranged themselves in a loose spread, experienced positioning, no clustered targets, clear sight lines to the door. Professional. He noted it and filed it. Your operation is finished, Serath said. He said it without preamble, without the preliminary diplomatic softening that a man trying to establish rapport uses. He said it because it was true, and because these men were professionals, and professionals respect directness over theater. The delegation left Verith this morning. The correspondence chain has been secured. The 2 contacts you're asking us to release are going to remain detained while a formal review proceeds. That is what's happening, and it's not subject to negotiation. The man from the door spoke. Then Kavan stays. No, Serath said. He doesn't. He looked at the man with the full, undecorated weight of a king who has been making people understand non-negotiable positions for 18 years and has gotten very good at it. Here is what I'm offering you. 1 time, no revision. You walk out of this building. You walk out of the palace gate. You're given 4 hours before any pursuit is organized, which is enough time to reach the southern road if you move at pace. What you do not get is your contacts, because those men have information that belongs to this kingdom, and they're going to provide it through formal process. You're asking us to abandon— I'm telling you what the alternative looks like, Serath said. There are 8 of Soren's people outside this building right now, which you can choose to believe or not. The 2 at the east wall corner you may have already noticed. The others are at positions you have not identified. If this goes wrong, you don't walk out. If you take my offer, you do. He paused. You planned this operation for leverage, not for escalation. You're not here to kill a general. You're here to recover assets. I'm telling you the assets are not recoverable through this method, which means continuing to hold him provides you nothing except a deteriorating situation. The room was quiet. The 3 men were reading each other with the peripheral communication of people who work together, the small signals that function beneath language. The man from the door was doing the arithmetic. Serath could see the process, weighing the 4-hour window against the value of the contacts against the credibility of the 8-person claim against the overall read of the man standing in the middle of the room in a road cloak without visible armor. What they were reading was the absence of theater. A king who comes to a hostage situation alone and unarmored is either making a profound miscalculation or is so certain of his position that the armor is beside the point. They were deciding which one this was. 20 seconds of silence. Then the man from the door nodded. Kavan's bindings were cut. He stood without assistance, with the deliberate steadiness of a man demonstrating that he is functional. He walked to the door. He did not look back. Serath followed him, and the two of them walked through the door and into the east yard. And behind them, the storage building held 3 men doing the arithmetic on 4 hours in a southern road. Soren materialized at the east wall corner as they crossed the yard. "The building," Serath said. "Managed," Soren said, which meant the positions were set and the 4-hour window would be real, and the southern road would be watched from a distance that ensured accountability without triggering a conflict that served nobody's current interest. He was efficient in the way that genuinely competent people are efficient, invisibly and entirely. Kavan walked beside Serath across the yard and said nothing until they were through the inner gate and into the corridor, where the palace resumed itself around them with the unreflective normality of a large institution that keeps moving regardless of what occurs at its edges. Then he said, "The boy." "Safe," Serath said. "Neris also. They're at the garrison in Selvath." Kavan was quiet for a moment. His jaw worked slightly over the bruise, which was already deepening to the kind of purple that suggested it had been significant at the moment of impact. "You rode out alone?" "Yes." "To a coastal village?" "Yes." Another silence. "I told the men who took me that you would handle it." Kavan's voice was neutral, with the effort of being neutral. "I told them that whatever they were planning, the king would handle it, because that is what the king does. I want you to know I believe that." "I know you did," Serath said. "I also want you to know," Kavan continued, with the particular cadence of a man who has decided, in the aftermath of a situation that could have gone differently, to say the thing he would normally not say, that I have served 3 kings in this palace, and I have never once served a king I actually respected until I served you. And I want that on the record somewhere, even if the record is just this corridor." Serath looked at him. "It's on the record," he said. Kavan nodded. He did not make it sentimental, neither did Serath. They were both men whose instinct was toward action rather than elaboration, and the elaboration had been done, and what came next was the rest of the work. The rest of the work took 4 more days. 4 days in which the formal review of Selene Morvain proceeded through the mechanisms that Varethi law provided for, which were slow and precise and required documentation that Soren's team produced with the painstaking accuracy of people who understood that incomplete process is worse than no process at all, because incomplete process creates the openings that future revisions exploit. Selene cooperated as she had said she would. Her cooperation was thorough, which suggested she had made the calculation that thorough cooperation now was the most efficient available path to a livable future. He did not fault her for the calculation. Calculation was what she was. He had simply, finally, stopped mistaking that for something else. Halcrest tendered his resignation from council on the 3rd day, in a letter of 6 paragraphs that was more self-serving than Serath might have preferred, but which served its purpose. It created a clean administrative record and avoided the kind of public proceeding that would have provided the Eastern Coalition with a narrative they could use externally. Halcrest was offered a provincial posting of modest significance. He accepted it. He would do adequate work there and cause no further difficulty, because he was, above everything, a man who understood his available options and chose the functional one. The 2 detained coalition contacts provided their information through formal review. The information was thorough, which was less a tribute to their cooperation and more a reflection of the fact that Soren's team was extraordinarily good at the particular kind of patient questioning that made it easier for people to give information than to withhold it. The Eastern Bloodline Coalition would know, within weeks, that their Varethi operation had been fully unwound. They would make adjustments. They would not, Serath assessed, attempt the same approach again, because the specific vulnerabilities they had identified and exploited no longer existed. He was not the same king he had been 18 months ago. The court was not the same court. The variables that had made the plan viable were different now, and different in ways that were not reversible. On the 4th day, he wrote the abdication document. This surprised the people around him, though none of them said so in ways that were direct. Soren's face had contained 17 different things when Serath told him, all of which he managed with characteristic restraint. Kavan had been quiet for a long moment and then had said very carefully, "Is this a decision or a direction?" Serath had said it was a decision. Kavan had nodded and then said, "Yeah, then it's the right one. which Serath had not expected, and which had occupied a portion of his thinking for several hours afterward. The document named Aeron heir and established a regency council, Kavan, Soren, Treasurer Idris, and Captain Dove. That would govern the Empire's daily function until Aeron reached majority. It was not a document of defeat. It was a document of design, the most deliberate thing Serath had written in 18 years of deliberate action. He understood that an empire of this size and complexity needed stable institutional governance more than it needed the specific person who had built it, and that the attachment of that specific person to the throne past the point of his best effectiveness was exactly the kind of mistake that unraveled the work of a lifetime. The empire would function better with a council and an heir than with a king who had arrived at a place in himself that was incompatible with the particular kind of hardness the throne had always required. Some people understand this. Most do not. The ones who do not hold on until the holding on has cost more than the letting go ever would have. He had held on long enough. He signed the document at the war table, at the desk where 18 years of campaign maps and dispatch seals and strategic decisions had accumulated into the sediment of a reign. He set the pen down. He looked at the signature for a moment. It was his name in the hand he'd had since he was 14, the same hand that had signed orders and treaties and death warrants and land grants, unchanged in its shape by all those years of use. He was still that person. He was also, now, something additional. He left the palace 2 days later, not dramatically. The Empire did not stop for it. He walked through the northern gate in the same plain road cloak, with a horse and road provisions, and nothing that marked his departure as the departure of a former king. The gate sentries stood at attention, which was acknowledgement without ceremony, and he appreciated the distinction. Kavan stood at the gate with the expression of a man who is holding himself together by the force of 40 years of professional discipline, and Serath put his hand on Kavan's shoulder for a moment. Not long, but long enough, and then mounted and rode. He reached Selvath as the afternoon was turning toward evening, the sea light going gold across the cliff face, the birds on the rock ledges doing the things birds do at that hour. He rode through the village, and the landlady's door was open, and the garrison captain was sitting on the front step with Aeron, who was pointing at something on the cliff face and talking with the focused energy of a child who has identified something that requires immediate documentation. Aeron saw him first. He stood up from the step and watched his father ride to the gate of the property, and there was that assessment in his face again, that careful reading of available information, and then something in the small face shifted, the way the face of a child shifts when it receives something it has been holding space for, when the thing it was hoping for arrives and the hope can relax. "You came back," Aeron said. "I came back," Serath said. He dismounted. The landlady appeared in the doorway. He nodded to her and she disappeared back inside with the discreet efficiency of someone who understands that the moment belongs to other people. The garrison captain looked at the cliff face as though something fascinating had just occurred there, and Serath noted her discretion with the appreciation he had always reserved for people who understood the value of leaving space. Neris was in the garden side of the property, at a stone table with a book she was not reading. She heard the horse and the voice and the boy, and she stood. And she came around the corner of the building, and she stopped when she saw him standing in the yard in the evening light, without armor and without crown and without any of the apparatus of the thing he had been. She looked at him. He looked at her. There is a particular quality to the moment when two people who have been circling something for a very long time finally stop moving. The circling had been 8 years, and underneath the arrangement and the necessity and the careful management of a palace where everything had a cost, there had always been something real. He understood that now with the specific, unglamorous clarity of someone who has had everything stripped back far enough to see the actual structure. "It's done," he said. "I know," she said. "Kavan sent word yesterday." "He would." He looked at her across the yard. "I signed the abdication document 4 days ago." She was quiet for a moment. "I didn't ask you to do that." "I know you didn't." He held her gaze. "I did it because it was the right thing for the Empire, and because I have spent 18 years understanding the difference between what the throne requires and what a person requires, and I was running out of ways to pretend the two were compatible." He paused. "I was also running out of ways to pretend I hadn't wasted something I had, something I was given that I didn't tend." Neris looked at him with the full weight of those clear dark eyes, And what was in the look was not the softness of a resolved narrative. It was the harder thing, the look of a woman who has sustained real damage and is not pretending otherwise, who is also, underneath that truth, still present, still looking, still here. "I'm not the same as I was 8 years ago," she said. "Neither am I." "The woman who came into that palace as an alliance arrangement," she continued carefully, each word placed with the precision of someone who has been thinking about exactly this for a long time. "She survived by being patient and enduring and self-contained. I don't know if I can do that anymore. I don't think I should have to." "You shouldn't," he said. "You never should have." He took 2 steps toward her, stopped, not because he was uncertain, but because what came next required her to close the remaining distance, or not, on her own terms. Which was the point, which had always been the point, and which he had spent 18 years not understanding. "I'm not asking you to go back to what we were. I'm asking you to let me show you what I understand now that I didn't then." He looked at her steadily. "That's all. Nothing beyond that. You decide the rest." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she closed the remaining distance. Not with rush, not with drama. She walked to where he was standing and stopped within arm's reach, and she looked up at him with the face she had always had in the garden room on Tuesdays. Not the queen's face, not the composed palace face, her actual face, the one he had not earned the right to see clearly until he'd lost the position from which he'd been looking. And she said, "You have to be patient." "I know," he said. "I mean, genuinely patient, not diplomatically patient, not strategically patient. I know the difference now." She looked at him. Something in her face moved, not a smile, not yet, but the precursor of one. The small movement of a person whose guard has been built very high and is deciding, with full knowledge of the cost, to lower it by 1 stone. 1 stone was enough for now. 1 stone was an enormous thing. "Then stay," she said. He stayed. The weeks that followed were not the resolution of a love story in the uncomplicated sense that word usually implies. They were harder than that, and more real. There were mornings when Neris woke before dawn with the specific anxiety of a woman who has learned to survive by expecting loss and has not yet trained her body out of the habit. There were evenings when Serath sat with the coastal dark and felt the absence of the weight he'd carried for 18 years. Not as relief, not exactly, but as a kind of dislocation, the disorientation of a man who has put down something so heavy for so long that the lightness feels wrong. Change does not arrive cleanly. It arrives in increments, in the daily accumulation of different choices, in the small and unglamorous work of becoming something other than what you were. Aaron flourished. That was the word. Flourished. He learned the names of every bird on the cliff face and then began cataloging them in a small notebook he'd asked the landlady to purchase for him in the village market. He watched the garrison captain run her morning drills and asked her questions about formations with the focused interest of a child who has inherited, from both parents, the instinct to understand how things work. He sat with Serath in the evenings and asked questions about the empire, not with longing or demand, but with the genuine curiosity of someone who is beginning to understand the shape of a large and complicated world. Serath answered him honestly, including the answers that were complicated, including the answers that required him to say, "I did not handle that well," or "I understand now that I was wrong about that." He answered the way a man answers when he has decided that truth is not a liability. It was, in its way, the most significant thing he had ever taught anyone. The empire continued without him. He followed the council dispatches that Kavan forwarded irregularly with the abbreviated notation of a man who is providing information but not seeking direction. The Regency Council functioned with the steady competence of people who had been watching a king operate for years and had learned more than they'd been given credit for. There were difficulties. There are always difficulties, because governance is the management of a system that generates problems faster than it resolves them, and the goal is never the absence of problems but the functional capacity to address them. The council addressed them. Serath read the dispatches and offered nothing unless asked, and occasionally he was asked, and he answered briefly and without the instinct to resume control, which was a restraint he had to actively maintain for the first several months, and which became, over time, less effortful. The abdication was not regret. He examined it for regret carefully, periodically, the way you check a wound to see if it's healing. There was loss in it. The loss of the identity he had worn for 18 years. The loss of the specific purpose that comes with carrying something enormous. But underneath the loss was something that did not have an adequate word in the Verethi political vocabulary, which was a vocabulary oriented entirely toward acquisition and maintenance, and had very little infrastructure for describing the sensation of having put something down. The word Neris used on an evening 3 months after his arrival in Selvath, sitting at the stone table in the garden while Aaron slept inside and the sea moved below the cliff in the dark, was peace. Not the absence of difficulty, she said, but the presence of something worth coming home to. She said it simply, without ceremony, watching the water. He said nothing, because nothing needed to be added to it, and some things survive best in the space that follows them. He had been taught, by the Empire and its long curriculum of hard lessons, that power was the mechanism by which a man protected what mattered. He had spent 18 years believing this and building accordingly. What the Empire's curriculum had not taught him, what it had in fact actively trained him away from, was the understanding that the things worth protecting cannot always be protected by power. Sometimes they can only be protected by the willingness to be present for them, to show up without armor, to sit at a stone table in the dark and say nothing and be there. That was not weakness. It had taken him most of his life to understand that it was not weakness. A king who never learns that lesson dies in his throne room, surrounded by subjects who obey him and no one who knows him. Serath had come very close to that ending. He had turned away from it at the last available moment, and the turning had cost him everything he'd spent his life building and given him back everything he'd spent his life not noticing he was losing. Some men would have called that a bad trade. He did not. The crown of Verith sat in the palace treasury, wrapped in the protocol cloth, waiting for a prince who was currently filling a notebook with the names of coastal birds. It would wait as long as it needed to. It was iron and gold, and it would not diminish in the waiting. The man who had worn it was sitting beside a stone table in a village on a cliff above the sea, watching his wife read in the lamplight, watching his son sleep through the window behind her, watching the ordinary, incomprehensible fact of being present for his own life. Some crowns are forged from gold, others from the long, slow work of becoming someone worth the wait. Only one of them leaves something in your hands when you finally set it down. Only one of them was ever really yours to carry.